The box wasn't even heavy. One legal pad. A spare phone charger. A framed photo of my daughter taken at her college graduation 2 years ago. And a small cactus I'd been carrying from office to office for 11 years because it never needed anything from anyone and it always survived. That was everything I brought with me on my first official day as Vice President of Operations at Halverson Group. My name is Renata Solis. I was 43 years old that Monday morning. I had spent the better part of 6 years inside that building, not as a permanent employee, but as the consultant who quietly rebuilt everything that made the company worth anything. I knew the layout of every floor. I knew which elevator was slower. I knew the code to the executive kitchen and the name of every security guard on the morning shift. I had logged more hours in that building than most of the people who had actual offices there. But that day was different. That day I had a VP badge clipped to my jacket. And for the first time in 6 years, my name was on the organizational chart. I felt calm walking in. I had earned this. Not through politics or favors or connections. Through work. Specific, technical, unglamorous work that had transformed a company bleeding money into one of the most operationally efficient logistics firms in its category. I wasn't walking in hoping things would go well. I was walking in knowing exactly what I had built and exactly what I was worth. I made it to my new office. I set the box down on the desk. I plugged in my laptop. I hadn't even taken my jacket off when my phone rang. It was the executive assistant from the COO's office. She asked me to come up to the conference room on the 15th floor. She said it was just a quick orientation meeting. I took the elevator up. I walked into a glass-walled conference room with a long table and 3 chairs on one side. 2 of those chairs were already occupied. One by a man I had never met before. The other by a woman from HR I recognized by face but had never spoken to directly. The man stood as I came in. He introduced himself as Conrad Bryce. Yusuf. Hired 3 weeks before my start date. He was maybe 45, very well dressed, with the kind of polished confidence that comes not from knowing things but from never having been wrong in front of the right people yet. He gestured to the empty chair across from them. I sat down. He didn't waste any time. He told me the executive structure was being realigned. That decisions had been made at the leadership level. That my position, and here he paused just slightly the way people do when they are reading language they rehearsed, was being dissolved effective immediately. He slid a white envelope across the table. The woman beside him, Patrice Alland from HR, placed a second document in front of me. A non-disclosure agreement. She explained that signing it was a condition of receiving the severance package outlined in the envelope. I looked at both documents. Then I looked at Conrad Bryce. He hadn't asked my name. Not once. Not when I walked in. Not during his speech. He spoke to me the entire time as though he already knew everything about me that he needed to know, which is to say he spoke to me as though I were nobody. At one point he referred to me as the consultant. Not Renata. Not Miss Solis. The consultant. I picked up the termination letter and read it carefully. There it was, in the official language of the document. My role listed as operational consultant. Not Vice President of Operations. Not VP. Consultant. Which was not what my signed employment agreement said. Which was not what the offer letter said. Which was not what any of the onboarding documents I had countersigned 2 months earlier said. They had used the wrong word. In a legally binding termination document. I set the letter down. I did not sign the NDA. Take them both. I picked up my box, the same box I had carried in 40 minutes earlier, and I walked back to the elevator. In the lobby I sat down on a bench near the front entrance. 3 minutes. I sat there for exactly 3 minutes. Not because I was in shock. I was not in shock. I sat there because I needed to think clearly before I moved, and I have learned over the course of my career that the most dangerous thing you can do in a high-stakes moment is react before you have thought. So I sat. And I thought. And the thought that came to me, the one that settled over everything else like a very quiet fact, was this. Conrad Bryce had just fired the woman who built the system his entire company ran on. And he didn't even know my name. He was going to find out. I drove home in silence. Not angry silence. Thinking silence. There is a difference. Angry silence is reactive. Closes things down. Thinking silence opens everything up, turns every detail over, looks at it from every angle. That is what I needed on that drive. By the time I pulled into my driveway I already had the broad shape of what had happened, And more importantly, the broad shape of what I knew that Conrad Bryce did not. Let me take you back. Because to understand why that Monday morning was not the end of my story, you need to understand what I actually built. 6 years ago, Halverson Group was quietly falling apart. From the outside, the company looked fine. Mid-sized logistics firm, decent client roster, respectable revenue on paper. But underneath that surface, the operations were a disaster. Their pricing model for logistics contracts had not been updated in years. Their client billing system had so many manual workarounds that errors were practically built into the process. And those errors were expensive. When I came in to assess the situation, the finance team showed me internal data that made my stomach drop. They were losing close to $2 million every quarter. Not from bad contracts but from billing mistakes. Undercharging clients. Reconciliation failures. Revenue that should have been captured just quietly walking out the door. I was brought in to fix it. Not to manage it. Not to consult on it. To fix it. So I did. Over the next 14 months, I designed and built what would become the company's core revenue operations system. Internally, everyone called it RO6. It was not purchased software. It was not a licensed product from some vendor. It was custom-built, from the architecture up, by me. Every logic pathway, every reconciliation rule, every automated billing check. I designed it, built it, tested it, and delivered it. Halverson Group went from losing $2 million a quarter in billing errors to running one of the cleanest revenue operations in their industry. RS6 became the backbone of how they did everything. Client contracts were structured around its capabilities. New enterprise deals were sold on the promise of what it could deliver. Over 6 years, it had processed hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The company's own internal valuation, which I had seen in a board report 2 years earlier, placed the competitive value of the platform at approximately $180 million. Now here is the part that most people at Halverson did not know. When the original consulting contract was written, it included an attachment, Attachment D, which was supposed to be the IP assignment agreement. The document that would formally transfer ownership of RO6 from me to Halverson. Standard practice. Clean and simple. Except it was never signed. The CEO at the time, a man named Paul Ogden, was in the middle of a separate acquisition deal when we finalized the project. His office rushed the paperwork. Multiple emails went back and forth. His assistant assured mine that Attachment D would be handled in the next administrative cycle. And then it wasn't. And then the project closed. And then everyone moved on. I noticed the gap about 2 years later, while reviewing documents for a completely different client. I went back through my own files, cross-referenced everything, and confirmed what I suspected. Attachment D had never been countersigned by Halverson Group. And the contract language, the base contract language, not the attachment, stated clearly that until Attachment D was executed by both parties, all intellectual property created under the engagement remained the property of the consultant. That was me. It remained mine. I said nothing at the time. I had no reason to use it. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was building a career inside a company I genuinely believed in. But I kept the documents. Every version of them. I kept them the way I keep everything. Organized, labeled, dated, filed. And there was one more thing. RS6 had 2 layers. The surface layer, the part the internal IT team maintained, was visible and relatively accessible. But underneath it I had built a secondary component. A reconciliation module. It was the piece of the system that quietly caught discrepancies before they became errors, before they became money lost. Prevented roughly $14 million in annual revenue leakage. It ran in the background, invisible to most people. And it had never been documented. Not because I hid it, but because I was always there. I was always the person who calibrated it. No one ever thought to ask me to write it down, because no one ever imagined I would be gone. Conrad Bryce had fired the woman who was the only documentation that system had. He was about to find out exactly what that meant. I gave myself 1 day. 1 day to feel the weight of what had happened. To sit with the unfairness of it. To acknowledge privately and honestly that it hurt. 6 years of work. 6 years of showing up quietly, doing the hard technical labor, building something that made other people look good. And then one Monday morning, a man who had been in the building for 3 weeks handed me an envelope and called me the consultant. I allowed myself that 1 day. Then I went to work. My home office is not impressive looking. It's a spare bedroom with a long folding table, 2 monitors, a printer and 4 lateral filing cabinets lined up against the wall. Those cabinets are where I keep every document from every client engagement I have ever completed. Contracts, amendments, deliverable receipts, change orders, email confirmations, sign-off letters. Everything organized by client, by year, by document type. I pulled the Halverson Group drawer and I started from the beginning. It took me the better part of 2 days to reconstruct the full contract history. Not because the documents were hard to find, they weren't, I knew exactly where everything was. But because I was reading carefully. I wasn't just looking for what I remembered. I was building a complete picture. Every amendment, every addendum, every email thread that confirmed a decision or a deadline or a deliverable. I found attachment D exactly where I expected it. In the project closeout folder, filed under the date the original engagement officially ended. There it was, a 4-page document titled, IP Assignment and Full Ownership Transfer Agreement. My signature was on the last page. The line for Halverson Group's authorized signatory was blank. Then I found the email chain. 7 emails between my project coordinator and Paul Ogden's executive assistant, spanning about 3 weeks. The assistant's final message sent on a Thursday afternoon said this: Paul is tied up with the Meridian close. We'll loop back on attachment D in the next admin cycle. Nothing will fall through the cracks. It fell through the cracks. I also located the specific language I needed in the base consulting contract. Section 11, subsection C. It read in plain terms that in the event any intellectual property assignment attachment referenced in the agreement was not fully executed by both parties, all work product and intellectual property created during the engagement would remain the exclusive property of the consultant until such time as a valid assignment was completed. Until such time. I printed that page and set it on the table in front of me. Then I made a phone call. Leonard Park is a corporate IP attorney I had worked with 5 years earlier on a licensing matter for a different client. He is methodical and he is precise, which are the 2 qualities I value most in any professional I trust with something important. I did not tell him the full story on that first call. I wanted to ask one clean question and hear one clean answer. I asked him, if an IP assignment attachment is referenced in a consulting contract but never executed by both parties, does the underlying work product remain with the consultant? He paused. He asked what industry and what jurisdiction. I told him. He asked me to send the documents before he said anything else. I sent them that evening. He called me back 48 hours later. His answer was yes. Not a guaranteed yes. Not a simple yes. But a yes solid enough to stand on. The IP had not transferred and under the contract language it had never legally left my ownership. I still didn't celebrate. That is not how I operate. A legal position is not a win. It is a starting point. So I made a list. 4 columns on a single sheet of paper. What I owned. What I could prove. What Halverson needed that only I could provide. And what else had changed as a result of Conrad Bryce's termination letter. That last column is where things got interesting. Because buried inside a 2019 amendment to my original consulting agreement, an amendment that was added when I took on a second phase of work for Halverson, there was a clause. A dormant clause. One that neither Conrad Bryce nor anyone currently working in that building likely knew existed. It stated that if the consultant was formally hired as a direct employee of Halverson Group and subsequently terminated without cause within the first 90 days of employment, the IP provisions of the original consulting agreement would automatically reinstate in full. I had been terminated on day 1. They had triggered it themselves. Without knowing it existed. Without even knowing my name. I read that clause 3 times. Then I set the paper down and I sat very still for a long moment. The trap had not been set by me. It had been set by years of sloppy contract management and one impatient soul who thought he was cleaning house. All I had to do now was decide when to close it. I want you to understand something about how I work. I'm not a person who moves fast when it matters. I am a person who moves right. Those are not the same thing. Fast gets you into rooms. Right keeps you in them. And I had spent too many years doing careful, exacting work to throw it all away on an emotional timeline. So while Conrad Bryce was settling into his CO office and whatever reorganization he was engineering, I was at my folding table, building something he could not see coming. The first thing I did was formally engage Leonard Park. Not just for the IP question but to develop a complete legal position. We spent 3 working sessions over the following 2 weeks going through every document I had. Leonard prepared what he called a legal position paper, a formal written analysis of the IP ownership question, the reactivation clause, and the specific language in the termination letter that had listed my role incorrectly. That last detail mattered more than it might seem. If Halverson tried to argue that I had been terminated as a consultant rather than as a VP, their own paperwork contradicted them. My employment contract, my offer letter, my onboarding documents all said Vice President of Operations. The termination letter said, Operational Consultant. That inconsistency was not just an error. It was a problem for them. While Leonard worked on the legal side, I was building the factual record. I pulled every performance-related document I had from my 6 years at Halverson. Client satisfaction reports. Project completion assessments. Revenue impact summaries. I had copies of internal presentations, ones where RS6 was displayed to the board as the company's core competitive advantage, that made no mention of who built it. I found a board summary from 3 years earlier that described RS6 as an internally developed proprietary platform. I had been the one who built it. The word, internally, was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I cataloged every instance, every presentation, every report, every time my work had been absorbed into the company's identity while my name stayed invisible. Then I made 2 quiet phone calls. The first was to Priya Menon. Priya had been a data architect who worked directly with me during the RS6 build, the only person inside Halverson at the time who truly understood the technical architecture at a deep level. She had left the company about 2 years earlier and was now working for a logistics firm in a different market. I explained what had happened. I did not ask her to do anything she was uncomfortable with. I asked her if she would be willing to provide a written technical declaration, a signed, formal statement confirming that RS6 was designed, architected, and built entirely by me during the consulting engagement. She said yes without hesitating. She said she had always thought it was wrong that my name was never attached to that system publicly. She signed the declaration within the week. The second call was to Alan Krebs. Alan had been Halverson's CFO until about 18 months before my termination. He had left under circumstances that were described publicly as a mutual decision and privately as anything but. He had his own history with Halverson's leadership. When I reached him, I was careful. I told him what I knew and I told him what I needed to confirm. He was direct with me in return. He told me something I had suspected but not yet verified. The 3 largest enterprise clients in Halverson's portfolio, accounts that together represented roughly $61 million in annual contract value, had been sold directly on the capabilities of RS6. The client contracts themselves contained performance guarantees that were tied to the system's specific functions. Those clients had signed because of what the system could do, which meant if there was ever a question about who owned that system, those contracts were standing on unstable ground. That was not a small detail. That was a structural exposure. I also did one more thing during this period. Something I want to be clear about. I did not interfere with anything. I did not touch any data. I did not alter anything inside the system. But I did have an access credential from my consulting days that had never been deactivated after my termination. A read-only monitoring path that I had used historically to check on system performance. I used it once briefly just to observe. What I saw confirmed what I had already expected. Without my quarterly calibration inputs, the reconciliation module had begun producing small inconsistencies. Not catastrophic ones. Nothing anyone would notice yet. But the drift was there. And I knew from years of working with that system exactly what it meant. If no one corrected it, those small inconsistencies would compound. The module would begin generating errors. And the errors would eventually show up somewhere very visible, in client invoices. The clock was ticking. Quietly. Invisibly. But it was ticking. I had one final thing to prepare. Leonard drafted a formal notice of IP reinstatement. A precise legal letter asserting my ownership rights over RS6 and all derivative systems, citing the unsigned attachment D and the triggered reactivation clause. It was ready to send. I did not send it yet. I had learned something important over the course of my career. Timing is not just strategy. Timing is leverage. And I was not yet at maximum leverage. I put the letter in a folder, set it on the table, and I waited. 6 weeks after they walked me out of that building, Halverson Group held its annual partner summit. I found out about it through Priya. She still had a contact inside the company, a former colleague who occasionally passed along general news. Nothing confidential. Just the kind of information that circulates openly in any professional network. The summit was a 2-day event at a hotel conference center about 20 minutes from headquarters. Enterprise clients, key vendors, a small group of investors. The kind of event where Halverson's leadership got to stand on a stage and tell their best version of the story. I was not there, but I was paying attention. What I learned in the days that followed, through Priya's contact, through Alan Krebs, and through one client I had a long-standing professional relationship with, painted a picture that made my jaw tighten in a way I had to consciously relax. Conrad Bryce had commissioned a new presentation. He called it Project Precision. The deck was polished, the branding was new, and the centerpiece was what he described as Halverson's next-generation proprietary operations platform, built entirely in-house by their internal technology team, representing the future of intelligent logistics management. Project Precision was RO6. Same system. New name. New logo. A fresh coat of corporate paint over something I had designed and built from the ground up 6 years ago. Anne Conrad stood on that stage and presented it as though Halverson had created it. No mention of a consulting engagement. No mention of an outside architect. No attribution to anyone. Just the clean, confident claim that this was their platform, their technology, their competitive advantage. He also made promises about it that the system could not currently keep. I knew the architecture of RS6 better than anyone alive. I knew exactly what it could do and exactly what it could not do in its current state. Some of the capability claims Conrad made in that presentation: faster processing timelines, expanded integration options, a new predictive analytics layer. None of that existed in the system as it stood. He was describing a future version of something he didn't actually understand, to an audience that was deciding whether to trust him with their business. 2 of the clients in that room had worked directly with me during the original build. I knew their technical teams. I knew the specific questions those teams would ask. And I knew with certainty that the internal IT staff Conrad had standing by to field technical questions could not answer them correctly. Because the answers lived in documentation that only I had. Or more precisely, in knowledge that had never been documented at all. Then Alan told me about the board. In the weeks following the summit, Halverson's board had approved a $12 million infrastructure investment to expand Project Precision. Conrad had presented the expansion plan as a natural next step, a platform upgrade that would increase the system's capabilities and position Halverson as a technology-forward logistics leader. The board approved the budget without a detailed technical review. Why would they question it? Their CEO was confident. The platform had a new name and a professional deck. The numbers from the past 6 years looked strong. Those numbers looked strong because of RO6. Because of what I built. And now $12 million was about to be committed to expanding a system that Halverson may not have legally owned, and that their COO did not technically understand. I sat with all of this for several days. Every instinct I had wanted to move immediately. To send the IP notice that same week. To let the legal letter land while Conrad was still celebrating his successful summit and his board approval and his $12 million green light. But I didn't. I made myself wait. And here is why. If I sent the notice before the board had fully committed, there was a chance they could walk back the investment and reframe the situation as a minor contract oversight. They could minimize it. They could try to negotiate from a position of partial ignorance, pretending they hadn't fully understood what they were building on. I needed them fully committed. I needed Conrad fully on record. I needed every client relationship to be leaning on Project Precision before I made a single move. Because the more dependent the company became on a system it didn't own, the more leverage I had when the letter finally arrived. So I watched. I waited. I kept the notice in its folder. And in the background, invisible to everyone at Halverson, the reconciliation module continued its quiet, steady drift toward the moment when someone would finally notice something was wrong. I knew that moment was coming. I was ready for it. The call came on a Tuesday morning 9 weeks after my termination. But before I tell you about the call, let me tell you what was happening inside Halverson that week. Because the 2 things arrived at almost exactly the same time, and that timing was not luck. It was physics. When you remove the person who is holding something together, eventually the thing stops holding. The reconciliation module had been drifting for weeks. Small miscalculations. Fractions of a percent off in billing logic. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger an immediate alarm. But compound errors do not stay small forever. They grow. They stack. And eventually they become something that shows up on an invoice. That Tuesday, 2 of Halverson's major enterprise clients received incorrect billing statements. The first client had been overcharged by $340,000. The second had been undercharged by $218,000. Both errors traced back to the same source. A failure in the reconciliation logic that sat at the core of ROS 6. The module had run its automated cycle, but without the calibration inputs it needed, it had processed a set of contract rate adjustments incorrectly and pushed those errors through to the billing output. Halverson's operations team caught it within 24 hours. They escalated immediately. Conrad ordered his IT lead to locate the source and fix it. The IT team spent 4 days trying. They could not find it. And here is why. The reconciliation module had never been formally documented. The surface layer of ROS 6, the part anyone could see, the part the internal team had been maintaining, was documented well enough. But the reconciliation layer underneath it, the component I had built as a precision safeguard, existed entirely in my own notes and my own memory. No formal documentation had ever been created because I had always been the documentation. I was always the person who ran the calibrations. I was always the person who could trace an error back to its source in under an hour. Without me, the team was working in the dark. They could see that something was wrong. They could not see where. That was when my phone rang. The number belonged to Cassidy Liu. She was the procurement director at Forest Industrial, one of Halverson's largest enterprise accounts, and one of the clients whose pricing model I had personally designed during the original ROS 6 build. Cassidy and I had worked closely together during that process. She was sharp, experienced, and the kind of professional who always remembered who actually did the work. She was polite on the phone. Calm, but direct. She said her team had flagged the billing error. She said they had reached out to Halverson's operations contacts and were not getting clear answers. She said their own technical people had taken a look at the data and believed the issue was somewhere inside the operations platform. And then she said something that I will not forget. She said, "The people over there don't seem to understand their own system, Renata. Do you know anyone who could help us sort this out?" I told her I would look into it. I kept my voice completely even. I thanked her for calling me directly. I told her I would be in touch. Then I hung up and I called Leonard Park. I told him it was time. That afternoon, Leonard sent the formal notice of IP reinstatement to Halverson Group's legal counsel. The letter was 4 pages long and it was precise in a way that left no room for confusion. It stated that under the terms of the original consulting agreement and the 2019 amendment, and specifically as a result of the reactivation clause triggered by Renata Solis's termination on day 1 of her VP employment, all intellectual property rights to ROS 6, including the full system architecture, the reconciliation module logic, all supporting documentation, and any derivative enhancements made during or after the consulting engagement, had legally reinstated to Renata Solis. It demanded a written response within 10 business days. I am told, through Leonard, who heard it through opposing counsel the following morning, that the letter arrived while Conrad Bryce was in a meeting with the full board. His legal counsel walked in, leaned down, and handed him a printed copy. The meeting stopped. 10 business days. The clock had started. And Conrad Bryce was sitting in a room full of board members who had just approved a $12 million expansion of a system they were now being told their company did not own. The response from Halverson's legal counsel came on day 12. 2 days past the deadline. I noted that. Leonard noted it too. When a company blows past a formal legal deadline, it usually means one of 2 things. They are stalling because they are scared, or they are stalling because they are still trying to find a way around what they have been handed. In this case, I suspected it was both. The letter they sent requested an in-person meeting at their offices. It described the meeting as an opportunity for mutual clarification. Leonard read it, set it down, and looked at me across his conference table. He said, "They want to see who they are actually dealing with." I said, "Then let's show them." We arrived at Halverson Group's headquarters on a Thursday morning. I had not been inside that building since the day I carried my box out of it. I did not feel nervous walking back in. I felt the particular kind of clarity that comes when you have done everything correctly and you know it. The conference room on the 15th floor. The same glass-walled room where Conrad had handed me the termination envelope 10 weeks earlier, had been arranged with a long table and 5 chairs. On one side sat Conrad Bryce. Beside him was Nina Forsyth, Halverson's general counsel, a composed woman in her 50s who I could tell immediately was not happy about the position she had been placed in. On the far end of the table sat 2 board members, Robert Leong, the chairman, and Caroline Voss, an independent board director whose background was in corporate governance. Caroline had written 2 published papers on executive accountability and fiduciary responsibility. I had read both of them the week before. I sat across from them with Leonard beside me. Conrad opened the meeting. He was aggressive from the first sentence, which told me everything I needed to know about how the past 10 days had gone for him. He called the IP claim frivolous. He used the word opportunistic. He suggested that I was attempting to exploit a minor administrative oversight to extract money from a company I had once served as a contractor. He spoke for about 4 minutes without pausing. Leonard let him finish. Then Leonard placed 3 documents on the table and slid them toward the center so everyone could see them clearly. The first was the original consulting contract, the full document with every attachment listed in the index. He opened it to the signature pages of Attachment D. My signature. The blank line where Halverson's authorized signatory should have signed. He said nothing. He just let them look. The second document was the 2019 amendment. He had tabbed the specific clause, the reactivation provision, the one that stated clearly what would happen if the consultant was hired and then terminated without cause within 90 days. He read the relevant section aloud. Fully. Once. The third document was a formal legal opinion from a second independent attorney, a specialist in IP and consulting contract law, confirming that the IP reinstatement position was legally sound and that the reactivation clause had been validly triggered. Robert Leong read all 3 documents without speaking. He was methodical about it. He read each page. When he finished, he looked at Nina Forsyth and asked her one question. Did we know about Attachment D? Nina said they did not. The energy in the room changed. Not dramatically. Not with raised voices or sudden movements. It changed the way pressure changes in a room when a window opens. A shift you feel before you can explain it. Caroline Voss turned to Conrad. Her voice was even and professional, but there was no warmth in it. She asked him directly. When you presented Project Precision to the board and requested authorization for the $12 million infrastructure investment, were you aware that the underlying system's IP ownership was unresolved? Conrad said he had no reason to believe there was any dispute. Caroline pointed out that the consulting contract containing Attachment D was a discoverable company record. It was in Halverson's own legal files. She asked Nina whether that contract had been reviewed as part of the Project Precision planning process. Nina said it had not. There was a brief silence. The kind that means something has just been confirmed that cannot be unconfirmed. And then I spoke. For the first time in that meeting I spoke. I placed a 4th document on the table. I had prepared it myself, written in plain language. No technical jargon, nothing that required an engineering background to follow. It was a summary of the reconciliation module. What it was, what it did, why it existed, why it had failed 9 weeks ago, and what would happen to the system in the next 60 days if no one who understood it intervened. I placed a 5th document beside it. A letter from Cassidy Liu at Forest Industrial, signed and dated, stating that their continued contractual relationship with Halverson Group was contingent on the satisfactory resolution of the operations platform issue and the restoration of reliable billing performance. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I placed both documents on the table the same way I had placed everything else, calmly, precisely, without drama. Then I folded my hands and I waited. Conrad looked at the reconciliation summary. I watched his eyes move across the first page. I could tell from the way he was reading it, the slight pause, the way he went back to the top of a paragraph he had already passed, that he did not understand what he was looking at. And I could tell that everyone else in the room could see that too. Robert Leong looked at the Forest Industrial letter. Then he looked at the reconciliation summary. Then he looked at me. He asked me what I wanted. I had thought about how to answer that question for weeks. Not because I wasn't sure what I wanted. I was completely sure. I had known what I wanted since the second day after my termination, when I sat at my folding table with 4 columns on a sheet of paper and mapped out every piece of this. The reason I thought about it so carefully was because the way you answer a question like that, in a room like that, in front of people like that, determines everything that comes after it. I did not want to sound angry. Anger hands power to the other side. It makes you look unstable and it gives them a reason to dismiss you. I did not want to sound desperate. Desperation signals that you need something from them. I did not need anything from them. They needed something from me. I wanted to sound exactly like what I was, a professional stating the terms of a business resolution. So I answered Robert Leong in 3 parts. The first was formal IP acknowledgement. I wanted written confirmation signed by Halverson Group's authorized legal representative that the intellectual property for ROS 6 and all derivative systems, including Project Precision, belonged to me, and that Halverson had been operating under what the law would characterize as an implied license. That implied license needed to be replaced by a formal negotiated licensing agreement going forward. The second was Conrad Bryce's removal. I said it plainly. I was not requesting it out of personal satisfaction. I was requesting it on the basis of material misrepresentation. Conrad had presented Project Precision to the board as Halverson's proprietary in-house platform and had secured a $12 million capital commitment without disclosing that the system's IP ownership was unresolved, a fact that was discoverable in the company's own legal files. That was not an oversight. That was a governance failure with financial consequences. I looked briefly at Caroline Voss as I said this. She was already writing something on the notepad in front of her. The third was the structure of my re-entry. Not as a VP. Not as a consultant. I was done being either of those things inside Halverson Group. What I wanted was a long-term IP licensing agreement. Formal, documented, and correctly valued. Leonard's team had prepared a valuation based on the system's documented revenue impact, its replacement cost, and the annual revenue leakage it prevented. The licensing figure came to $4.2 million annually. I placed the valuation summary on the table beside everything else. Robert Leong looked at it. He did not flinch, which told me he was a man who had seen serious numbers before and understood what he was looking at. He said the board would need to adjourn and consider. I told him I understood completely. We left the building. Conrad's position did not survive the week. Halverson's general counsel advised the board formally, in writing, that Conrad's presentation of Project Precision to investors and the board, without disclosing the unresolved IP status of the underlying system, constituted a material disclosure failure. The board's continued public support of him after receiving that legal advice would have created direct fiduciary exposure for each of them personally. Caroline Voss, I later learned, had submitted her own written assessment within 24 hours of our meeting, citing the same governance concerns I had anticipated when I read her published papers. 11 days after our boardroom meeting, Conrad Bryce resigned. The press release described it as a planned leadership transition. I read it once and did not think about it again. The IP licensing agreement was finalized 6 weeks later. $4.2 million annually. 5-year initial term. Renewable. My system. My terms. I did not return to Halverson Group as an employee. I did not want to. Instead, I registered my own firm the week after the boardroom meeting. A small consulting and IP licensing company, just me and 2 contractors I trusted completely. Halverson Group became my first client. Forest Industrial became my second. Cassidy Liu reached out personally to retain me to evaluate Forest's internal operations infrastructure. She said she had always known the work at Halverson was mine. She said she had just been waiting to have a reason to work with me directly. The system I built, the one that had been running silently for 6 years inside a company that had absorbed it without ever putting my name on it, was now the foundation of something I owned entirely. And there is one last thing I want to tell you. That NDA. The one Patrice Alland slid across the table to me on the morning Conrad Bryce fired me. The one I was supposed to sign before I left the building. I never signed it. And it was not because I was planning all of this in the moment. It was because I looked at that document before I picked up my box and I saw that the name on it was wrong. It did not say Renata Solis. It said, the consultant. The same way Conrad had referred to me throughout that entire conversation. As a category, not a person. As a function, not a name. I decided in that moment that I would not sign a document that did not know who I was. And I decided something else too. Something quieter. Something I carried with me out of that lobby and into everything that came after. I decided that I was done being the unnamed woman in someone else's room. I had built the room. It was time to put my name on the door.